Mutinies like the one that took place in 1789 on the sailing ship Bounty, which became world famous through literature and film, hardly ever occurred in units of the German Wehrmacht during the Second World War. Not only would such actions have inevitably led to execution, the trauma of the 1918 revolution that started in Wilhelmshaven and Kiel also ran too deep. Back then, sailors and stokers on numerous ships and boats of the Imperial High Seas Fleet refused to obey orders and, instead of the Imperial War flag, raised red flags. However, in 1945, there was indeed a mutiny, which took place just days before the capitulation on May 8th, namely on May 5th on the minesweeper M612. Here is a picture of this type of boat. Instead of joining a transport to Courland, the crew, under the leadership of the 21-year-old machinist Heinrich Glassmacher, locked up the commander, a naval lieutenant, at gunpoint. They then took over the boat. After neutralizing 2 more officers, they attempted to reach the German city of Flensburg from the Danish port of Fredericia. However, they were confronted by several fast boats. In the subsequent court-martial, 11 crew members were sentenced to death by shooting, and 4 others were sentenced to prison terms. Also in the Navy, this time in the modern German Navy, a mini-mutiny is said to have taken place around November 7, 2010, on the training ship Gorch Fock. Sea cadets, as the officer candidates in the Navy are called, refused to climb the rigging out of fear after an inexperienced cadet had fallen to her death from the mast. But the incident I have just described, which I only referred to as a kind of mutiny, is in no way, not even remotely, comparable to the events that were repeatedly carried out in the Wehrmacht during the Second World War by so-called foreign soldiers dressed in German uniforms. In my video, Texel 1945, The Betrayal of the Georgians, I already reported on the mutiny of the Georgian Infantry Battalion 822, which had been integrated into the Wehrmacht and, with a strength of 756 men, was deployed as a German occupation force and to defend against a possible Allied landing on the Dutch North Sea island of Texel. On the night of April 5th to 6th, they brutally slaughtered their sleeping German cadre, with whom they had celebrated only the evening before. By sunrise, up to 400 of the sleeping men and unsuspecting German guards stationed on the island are said to have been murdered. This continued until German units brought to the island had killed most of the mutineers. Even in the Indian Infantry Regiment 950, originally formed only for propaganda purposes as part of the Indian Legion, which this video is about, there had been various acts of insubordination, hunger strikes, and mutinies since 1943. A larger number of soldiers of the Indian Legion had initially refused to be transferred from Germany to the rough Dutch North Sea coast of the Atlantic Wall, and later, after their transfer to southern France, to the southern wall near Poitiers in 1943, and at the beginning of the Allied invasion in 1944. Here, in August, during an inspection by Field Marshal Rommel, they refused to fight against the so-called Free French troops, or partisan groups. Some of them also defected to the partisans. However, there had been no deadly attacks on their German supervisory personnel. Even in the commando unit of the Chief of German Military Intelligence in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, there was an incident. He led the legendary Brandenburg Division, in which, starting in the autumn of 1943, each battalion received a 4th, so-called Legionnaire Company, made up of Russians, Ukrainians, Caucasians, and others. In the same year, all the 4th companies deployed in the central sector of the Eastern Front mutinied, except for a few groups. After murdering the German supervisory personnel, they defected to the Red Army. By this time, the Wehrmacht was teeming with foreign soldiers from all sorts of countries, with all kinds of motivations and qualities. If you look only at the volunteers from the many Soviet peoples and ethnic groups, or at the soldiers recruited from the prisoner of war camps together with the so-called Hueys, the auxiliaries, you can assume a number of up to 1 million, most of whom were grouped together in the divisions of the Waffen-SS. With this huge number of fundamentally different men, who either volunteered or put on the German uniform out of hunger and fear of dying in the prisoner of war camp, the vast majority stayed with their units until the end of the war. However, many of the foreign soldiers deployed in the Wehrmacht were also responsible for numerous war crimes. A representative example is the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, noted for their role in the Holocaust and for their involvement in the earlier mentioned Ukrainian mutiny. On Texel, there were also a considerable number of incidents in which foreign soldiers turned against their German comrades, resulting in a significant number of deaths. For example, in Villefranche-de-Rouergue, France, on the night of September 16th to 17th, 1943, with the 13th SS Mountain Division, Handschar, Croatian No. 1. Internally, the Muslim soldiers were also called Moselle Germans. On that particular night of September the 16th to 17th, 1943, an infiltrated communist agent, the Bosnian Lieutenant Ferit Janic, who had previously served in the Royal Yugoslav Army and was now a lieutenant in German service, together with 3 others in the 13th SS Mountain Pioneer Battalion, triggered the uprising he had planned, during which 5 German officers were murdered. However, before German forces could be brought in, the battalion Imam Halim Malkok managed, through speeches to 2 Bosnian companies, to get these 2 units to suppress the mutiny within a few hours, during which around 150 insurgents were killed, including the leader, Janic. A further 18 had been executed after several court-martial trials, and 805 Bosnians, considered unreliable, were transferred to Germany for labor service in the Tod organization. They had resisted being deployed to the Tod organization. 265 had been taken to the Hamburg-Neuengamme concentration camp, which a number of them did not survive. Also in France, almost a year after the mutiny in the Croatian Handschar Division, on Sunday, August 27, 1944, the bloodiest mutiny took place. The perpetrators were 2 Schuma battalions of the 30th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, with Schuma standing for Schutzmannschaft. Here in the picture are the commanders of the Schuma battalions, 102, 115, and 118. This mixed unit of Eastern European volunteers and conscripts, with a disproportionately high number of Belarusians, was formed on July 31, 1944, from the so-called Schutzmannschaft Brigade Ziegling, named after Obersturmbannführer and Police Lieutenant Colonel Hans Ziegling. Back then, in August 1944, the division was relocated to the French city of Vesoul, which is situated along the railway line from Paris to Basel. This was to protect the strategic Burgundian Gate. That is the name given to the gently sloping saddle, about 400 meters high and 30 kilometers wide, in the background of the picture, not far from the Swiss and German borders, between the Vosges and Jura mountains. They were supposed to defend the area in the event of an expected attack by French partisans. According to reports, the morale of the troops was catastrophic. German officers and non-commissioned officers reportedly despised Ukrainian soldiers, viewing them as inferior. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians in turn distrusted the Germans and had no desire at all to fight against the French, especially since the course of the war had dramatically changed in favor of the rapidly advancing Allies. In this atmosphere, 26-year-old Major Lev Loba made his decision. Here you can see him after the war with the medals awarded to him by France. At first, he wanted to meet secretly with the French resistance leaders in advance. Then, Taking all their weapons and equipment with them, they planned to defect as a group and join the French in the fight against the Wehrmacht. While Captain Negrabetsky, commander of the other Ukrainian Schuma battalion, stationed in the Val d'Hone camp, marked in red, and also determined to mutiny, had already met with representatives of the French resistance on August 23rd. Major Loba also met with resistance leaders near Vesoul a day later. They could hardly believe it. The representatives of the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, the French Interior Forces, as the formal name of the resistance forces led by General de Gaulle, had almost incredulously accepted the Ukrainians' offer to switch sides with weapons and equipment, a hardly believable gift in wartime. However, they also set conditions. First, the French partisans would not actively support the cunningly planned Ukrainian mutiny. Second, after a successful mutiny, both Ukrainian battalions would be deployed under the command structure of the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur. Finally, in order to prove their genuine intention to defect, the Ukrainians would first have to kill all their German officers and non-commissioned officers, taking no prisoners. It began on the night of August 26th to 27th, 1944, with the Ukrainian battalion under Captain Negrabetsky. They murdered all the German officers and 500 strong defected to the French, taking with them an anti-tank gun, 4 82mm mortars, 8 heavy machine guns, and their personal weapons. After reports of this nightly mutiny reached the other battalion under Loba, on the morning of August 27th, the German SS Hauptsturmführer and captain of the Protection Police, Karl Hanstein, who was serving there as commander of the 3rd Battalion in the Waffen-Grenadier Regiment of the SS 75, organized a secret meeting with other German officers. It was hidden from the Ukrainians to brief them on the situation. In the meantime, an order had also arrived from the division to relocate the Schuma battalion, commanded by Loba, with its strength of over 1,000 men and its 300 horse-drawn wagons and carts, back to Vesoul, where they were to be disarmed. However, this order to retreat aroused Loba's suspicion that the German command had learned of his plan and was now taking countermeasures. While he rode at the head of the long, horse-drawn column toward Vesoul, surrounded by Ukrainian soldiers, the Germans marched in the middle of the column with the heavy weapons drawn by horses. More Ukrainians followed. Around noon, they reached the small village of Noiden-le-Ferreau. When the column passed a certain road and railway crossing designated by Loba, he gave his informed adjutant the agreed-upon signal with a nod of his head. The firing of a green flare. But when it went up into the air with a whistle, nothing happened at first. Since only a handful of Ukrainian officers and even fewer soldiers knew about his plan, and none of the few insiders had the courage to fire the first shot, Lieutenant Handschar, riding behind Loba, called out in Ukrainian to the crowd that the next signal to mutiny was to put on their helmets. The Ukrainian soldiers automatically carried out the order, and a senior lieutenant and police first lieutenant riding next to Handschar, also a former officer, put on his helmet as well. The Ukrainian took advantage of this, suddenly turned to the unsuspecting German and shot him several times in the head with his pistol. When the fatally wounded man fell from his horse, that was the beginning of the mutiny. The surprised German soldiers could not defend themselves as the Ukrainians shot or strangled everyone nearby. The picture shows surviving German soldiers after the massacre when a nearby German railway security company assigned to guard the railway line, mainly older policemen, approached, having heard the shots, and rushed to help. Loba had called out to them that it was a defense against a partisan attack. With this false report, they managed to lure the equally surprised soldiers of this company into the area of the Ukrainians. As a result, a large number of these German railway security personnel were also killed. In the end, the road was littered with dead German soldiers. The reported number varies between 102 and 234, including 25 officers and 75 non-commissioned officers, while the Ukrainians lost only one man. After their murderous act, the 820-man Loba battalion vanished into the nearby forests. In total, together with the Negrobetsky battalion, more than 1,300 Ukrainians had defected, who now reported to the French who were already waiting for them. Here is a group of the Ukrainians, now in the bandit lair of the partisans. As a kind of welcome gift, the Schuma battalion Loba had brought with them 4 anti-tank guns, 4 82mm mortars, 37 52mm mortars, 21 heavy machine guns, 120 light machine guns, 10 assault rifles, 700 carbines, 130 submachine guns, 545mm shells, 1,000 grenade launcher rounds, 500 horses, 280 wagons, as well as around 1 million rounds of infantry ammunition. At first, both Ukrainian units were incorporated into the Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur as the 1st and 2nd battalions. Later, a large part of the Ukrainians transferred to the 13th Half Brigade of the Foreign Legion, which was subordinated to the 1st Free French Division and was relocated to Marseille in southern France. After the war, a large number remained in the Legion and were deployed in Indochina, where this time they were allowed to fight and die for France. Those who chose to return to the Soviet Union after the end of the war were sentenced there to 25 years of imprisonment in the Gulag. Some of them were also executed as traitors. The German soldiers killed during the mutinies are buried in the military cemetery in Andili, about 10 kilometers north of Toul. With 33,085 fallen soldiers, this military cemetery is the largest German war memorial of the Second World War in France. Because of these incidents, 2,300 Ukrainians who were classified as unfit were sent to the so-called disgrace weapon finance regiments in Germany. 5,500 remained in the division. But these kinds of incidents had even increased as the Allies approached. For example, on October 17, 1944, in the 23rd Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Kama, which had been formed in eastern Croatia since June 10th, there was a mutiny in which a German officer was allegedly murdered. However, the division itself quickly suppressed the uprising, and just as in the night of September 16th to 17th, 1943, soldiers of the Croatian 13th Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Handschar mutinied again in September 1944, now for the second time. After the communist partisan leader Tito, here on the right with commanders of the partisan units, had offered a general amnesty for Croats fighting on the German side, more than 2,700 members of the division deserted with their weapons during the following 3 weeks. Either they simply went home or they joined the militia, the so-called Green Cadres, a term derived from those Austro-Hungarian soldiers who deserted and hid in the green forests here during the First World War, or the deserters from the Handschar division defected to the fascist Ustasha units under Ante Pavelic. By early October, 700 members of the Handschar division had also joined the particularly brutal fighting 3rd Proletarian Partisan Corps, which, like other Tito units, was responsible for numerous war crimes against German prisoners of war that remain unpunished to this day. There was also a mutiny in December 1944 in Hungary, where the division was deployed in Budapest within the notorious SS penal unit under Oberfuhrer Gustav Dirlewanger, despised by the Wehrmacht for its extreme brutality and disregard for the rules of war. Dirlewanger, described as morally unrestrained and power-obsessed, driven by cruelty and arbitrariness, had made crime the principle of combat. During this mutiny, members of regimental strength defected to the Red Army, and a former concentration camp commandant, who had been transferred to replace a fallen regimental commander, was summarily lynched by members of the 2nd and 3rd Companies, which consisted of former concentration camp inmates. The same fate likely befell Derlewanger, who was relieved of his command as division commander in February 1945, and, disguised as a civilian, was captured by the French around June 7th, 1945. He was identified by camp inmates. He was, in all likelihood, killed in this house used as a prison in Swabian-Alschhausen, either by former forced laborers or by French military prisoners of Polish descent. Then, in March 1945, see the video I mentioned at the beginning, there was a Georgian mutiny on the Dutch island of Texel, which resulted in numerous murdered German soldiers. Also in March 1945, there was a mutiny in the Dutch 34th SS Volunteer Grenadier Division, Landstorm, Netherlands, which had been formed on February 10, 1945. 4 Dutch SS men from the 7th Company of the SS Volunteer Grenadier Regiment 84 had planned to kill the German members of the company and then desert to the British. However, their plan was discovered, and the 4 Dutchmen were executed on March 9, 1945. Finally, there is also a mutiny to report in the area of the 6th Mountain Division stationed in Norway. The following events took place there shortly before the official end of the war on May 8th. On April 27, 1945, under the leadership of Karl Renner from the Socialist Party of Austria, the Republic of Austria was proclaimed here together with representatives of the 4 Allied victorious powers. At the beginning of May, Renner then demanded in a radio broadcast that all Austrian soldiers serving in the German Wehrmacht should surrender at the first opportunity. Soldiers from the 4th Battery of the Mountain Artillery Regiment 118 of the 6th Mountain Division, stationed near the Norwegian settlement Signaldalen Thalys, had also heard this call. However, Colonel Joseph Remold, who had been appointed as division commander since April 26, 1945, and later became the first commander of the Bavarian Riot Police in 1952, forbade the execution of this order to surrender. As a result, several Austrian soldiers from the 4th Battery murdered their 2 officers, Captain Durmbacher and First Lieutenant Fromm. Then, under the leadership of Corporal Bruckner, they split into 2 groups to reach neutral Sweden. While the larger group of 48 men reached Sweden, shown in red where they were interned, the smaller group of 11 men was captured by a Wehrmacht search party. After a court-martial, on May 10, 1945, 2 days after the Wehrmacht's surrender, 4 of the 11 deserters were executed. In conclusion, it can be stated that a large number of foreign volunteers in the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS were killed. The vast majority stayed with their German comrades until the end of the war, for whatever reasons. But military history also shows that these kinds of improvised units were not only vulnerable to enemy propaganda, but also behaved with particular cruelty toward fellow countrymen of different ethnic backgrounds. Moreover, they were also willing, as the war situation rapidly changed to Germany's disadvantage, by any means necessary, including numerous murders of their German comrades, to switch to the winning side. It must be remembered that, not infrequently, foreigners put into German uniforms in units mostly under the command of the SS were also responsible for numerous war crimes. However, these were hardly ever punished by their German commanders.